Okay, I'm going to get going right now. So good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar sponsored by SunGard K-12 Education. Before I pass things off to Joel, who's going to be moderating the webinar, I have a couple housekeeping items for today. One, we will be recording this webinar, so and you'll get that recording in a couple of days. You will also get a follow-up email in a couple of days with a recording, a copy of this recording, and a link to the slides that were used for the presentation. Additionally, if you have any questions to be used at the Q&A panel at the end of the webinar, please use the Q&A box in the lower right-hand side or use the chat box. And without further ado, I'd like to pass things off to Joel.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you for everyone who have joined us today for this session on formative assessment of performance checkup. I have a few words that I'm going to say to kind of set the stage to get us started for today, but mostly you'll be hearing from our panelists, and I'll be moderating as we move through the session for the next hour or so. Today we have joining us John Filippo, the founder and executive director for the Center for Educational Leadership and Technology. And John, I'd like to just give you a moment to say hello to everyone, introduce yourself, and give us a sense of your background.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And if you have nice sunny weather, send it up here to New England. But again, by way of background, I'm a former classroom teacher and high school principal, assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction. But here at the center, we try to look at a lot of these issues like formative assessment in very systemic ways. So a lot of my comments will be trying to put formative assessment as it relates to the whole system of the school district. But at the center, we spend pretty much every day of our time in the schools trying to figure out how do we take all these reforms, education reforms, which are an excellent one is formative assessment, and all this technology, and how do we fit those two together. And the point I want to leave you with is that, you know, way back when we put billions of dollars of technology in the workplace, they were only getting about a 0.5% or 1% gain in productivity. It wasn't until they tried to figure out how to reform corporate America and add IT together, they got a 10 to 12% gain in productivity. And us educators need to do the same. We need to figure out these are great reforms. What's the right tools? Not all tools support reforms in the same way. So that's just by background what we try to do. We've been doing this for almost 25 years now.
Great. Thanks, John. Fantastic introduction. Bethany Silver is the Director of Assessment, Evaluation, and Research at the Bloomfield Public School District. Bethany, can you share a little bit about yourself for the audience today?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joel. And good afternoon, John. I am the Director of Assessment for the Bloomfield Public Schools. I formerly have taught college and community college. I was a teacher there. And my background is I have a Ph.D. in educational psychology, and that's how I got into assessment. The organization that I work for now is the Bloomfield Public Schools. We are a reform district, and we have an intense focus on doing our work and really serving our learners, every single learner. And we've seen some very exciting improvements since 2011 when we adopted our data-driven strategy and the systemic integration of data teaming across the district. For example, our high school graduation rate has grown from 73.4% to 91.2% between 2011 and 2013. So we've seen a 17 percentage point increase in our graduation rate. So we are really focused on reform. We've closed some really significant gaps between our student performance and the performance with the rest of the students in Connecticut. And some other things that I do besides data work and assessment work in Bloomfield is that I'm a member of the Smarter Balanced team, where Connecticut is a Smarter Balanced state. I've done some item reviews for that assessment, as well as I'm currently supporting the development of the digital library, which it will be a resource for educators across Smarter Balanced states to provide them with vetted, reviewed, really comprehensively reviewed resources for educators, both in terms of supporting classroom instruction as well as professional development for teachers.
Great. Thanks, Bethany. And myself, I'm Joel Hames. I'm our Director of Product Management at SunGard K-12 Education. We have developed a number of software solutions for school districts around the country focused on student information, performance and assessment, financial and special education systems. I have about 16 and a half years of experience in school districts in California. I have my Master's of Educational Psychology. I've also worked in both IT and instructional technology, as well as testing and assessment programs as part of our instructional services deliveries in several school districts. So hopefully today, with the group that we have on the phone, we'll have a good, lively conversation about formative assessment, and you'll have a chance at the end to ask some questions that we will tackle. To get to that, let's talk just briefly about what we're looking at. So we did our introductions. The next thing we want to do is I'm going to provide a kind of high-level definition of formative assessment and really the specific form that we want to look at today and that we're going to be spending time on. This way we all have a common foundation to work from, a shared understanding of what the comments that come after will help explain or clarify. After that, we're going to dive deeper. We have a series of questions for our panelists that I'll be asking, giving them both an opportunity to look at formative assessment from a number of different angles, from kind of a systems viewpoint to what it means at the student level in the classroom. After that, we will have time for a Q&A, a chance for you to submit questions that we will, I'll pass along to the panelists. We'll take a shot at helping clarify anything that we discussed today, and then we'll wrap up at the very end. Now, to begin, what we'd like to do is ask questions of you, our participants. So we have two survey questions, and I'm going to put the first one up, and Liz, who is our host, will be able to put these questions up. We're going to take just a couple of minutes here, and we'll put the first question up and then the second one. And what this does is this will help guide some of our answers because it will give us a sense of the degree to which formative assessment is familiar to you or used in your school or your district or your classroom, and use that as a basis. So I can see the first question is up there. If you could take just a minute or two to answer that one, and I'll come back in just a moment. We'll answer our second one, share those results, and then we'll move on through the rest of the webinar. Okay, just a few more seconds here, and then we'll move on to our next question. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to our next question. I'll move it forward. Next question is, how confident are you in using formative assessment? That question will be up in just a moment.
Give me 1 second. It is finishing up the results from the first one. Second question's up.
Thank you, Liz. We'll take just a minute here to do this one, and then we'll move on. Okay, just a few more seconds. We'll finish up this poll question. Great. We'll take a quick peek at this, and I think this will be interesting results to help guide our conversation. So we'll give Liz just a moment to get these ready to share with us.
Okay, I'm going to share the results from the first question.
Okay.
It should show up.
Great, thank you. So our first one, how frequently do you use formative assessment in your district or classroom? It looks like that we had 30% of respondents indicated that it's embedded in the instructional model at the school or district, and that's fantastic. We, when it's a part of a deep embedded model, when it's supported by professional development and there's a shared understanding within a school or district, there's some great results that can come from that. And that's certainly where we like to head. But we do have regular intervals. We have 21% of respondents indicated that. Assessment calendars set by someone other than me, 13% have probably common assessments or interim assessments, certainly state assessments, for example, and those drive the assessment practices. And then there's a fair amount, 9% that said weekly during the school year. So that gives us a sense that there is a fair amount of exposure and experience with this concept and with the ideas here. So that certainly helps us. Liz, can you share with us the second slide here, the second question? And here we have, how confident are you in using formative assessment? We have 35% moderately confident, 26% very confident, 8% not very confident, and that's great. That will help drive an interesting across-the-board conversation as we dive into this. Those of you that are very confident will be looking for some additional insight or how to maybe help contextualize the work you do with respect to your colleagues in the larger environment, or maybe pick up a few additional strategies here. Certainly the Q&A session may work well, and the rest, those of you that are moderately confident or not very confident, hopefully as we describe more of the process, you'll find value there as well. So that helps give us a sense of what we're looking at with our audience today. Appreciate your time taking those questions, thinking about those and providing responses. So let's move on to defining formative assessment. As I said, I think it's critical we have a shared understanding, a common place to work from, and probably the most often cited or most frequent definition of formative assessment comes out of Black and Williams' work inside the Black Box back in 2001. Formative assessment is all those activities undertaken by teachers and or by students that provide information to be used as feedback to modify the teaching and learning activities in which they are engaged. One of the things that I think we need to take away from this, and we're going to dive more into in a few minutes, especially with our panelists, is that formative assessment is a process. Those of you that have been practicing for a while probably know this intuitively. There are many of you that may have see technology tools and textbooks and other things out there that claim that they are part of they are formative assessment. That a formative assessment in some way is a thing that you do, and it's really a process. It's not a moment in time event that occurs. And so Black and William are focusing on all the activities that kind of inform or give you information that you can then use to respond and modify instruction. It's, again, separated out from summative assessment, which would give us a great information about how well we did, but it's much less useful to the students because oftentimes it's delivered at the end of instruction and not during instruction. So we're going to dive into that process here in just a minute. Margaret Heritage, back in 2011, clarified further that whatever method teachers use to elicit evidence of learning, it should yield information that is actionable by them and their students. So some of the more common ways that we think of feedback for example, that can produce actionable change is being able to say to someone, great job, or great, you did okay, next time you need to craft a better thesis statement. I mean, these types of things are not truly feedback. Neither of those are particularly actionable by the student. But instead, if we look at it through, that deeper, more connected, more well-drawn-out description that helps the student understand exactly what it is that they need to improve, that they can take action on, then we can achieve at least that component of the formative assessment process. And we'll take a look at that here in a few minutes. James Popham also has described it as carefully crafted descriptive feedback will improve what goes on in almost every classroom. We know that this has a significant culture-shifting kind of change for students in their experience with education. So what we want to do now is start to talk a little bit more about that process. I'm going to provide one other kind of baseline piece for us to draw from, and I think you'll hear our panelists reflect on this as we go through. And that is the idea that there are 4 primary attributes of this process of formative assessment. It begins with clarifying intended learning, describing your learning targets and doing it in student-friendly language, something that they can grab onto and understand what the finish line looks like. What are they supposed to get to? We then move on to eliciting evidence. And this isn't just paper and pen tests. It's all the obtrusive and unobtrusive pieces that you take on or interactions you have with students where you look at the work they do and you sit next to them and provide that direct feedback. It's how they show evidence of their understanding of their competency, their mastery of a concept through any number of different avenues. After we elicit the evidence, we need to interpret it, understand what it means in the context of that student's experience, the learning target itself, how strong or how well was your observation when you elicited the evidence? Does that connect well with interpreting and understanding where they are? And then finally, acting on that evidence. How do you move the student forward? What kind of feedback are you giving them to then improve what they're trying to achieve? So these 4 attributes, clarifying intended learning, eliciting evidence, interpreting evidence, and then acting on that evidence, provides the foundation for the process that we're going to dive a little bit deeper on starting now. So the first question I have for our panel is, how can formative assessment, this process, be effectively integrated into the classroom? So Bethany, would you mind taking us through this question a little bit and providing a little bit of insight into how formative assessment can be effectively integrated?
Absolutely. Thank you, Joel. I think as part of my role here, I do have the opportunity to, we use a regular system of curriculum monitoring using a walkthrough process for each one of our schools where we look at the implementation of our curriculum. And I also am part of the team that has designed our teacher evaluation system, and we have the Kim Marshall model in place there. So we have 2 tools in our district that we use to, 2 different lenses that we use to look at what's happening in our classrooms. And the formative assessment component is a big part of really the quality of the implementation of our curriculum as well as the quality of instruction. And Joel, as you mentioned earlier, one of the first things that we do when we do our walkthrough process is to determine whether or not the intended learning has been clarified. So we're walking into the classroom and we're looking for obvious things like a learning objective posted on the board or available on the smart board, or some evidence somewhere in the classroom that the students refer to where they understand what is the intent of the instruction. We also look for evidence of learning targets. Now, these can be aligned to grade level expectations. They can be aligned to standard progressions as well as the Common Core standards. And what we're looking for really is evidence before we even start to listen and to observe. We have artifacts in the classroom that tell us that students are clear about what they need to know. And then, of course, we start to engage with the students. We will ask the students, can you tell us what you're learning? We're looking for students to be very clear and specific about what the learning goal is, what the learning target is, whether it's a process that the students are learning or it's a product that the students are creating. And as we are in the classroom and we're looking for evidence, we're looking for the teacher, as you mentioned earlier, to use a variety of questioning strategies, of focused observations, really intently engaged with students, monitoring student comprehension and student understanding, and following up closely with additional questions. So that's another thing that we're looking for when we walk into our classrooms is the teacher eliciting evidence. And it's not always the teacher, though. It could be that it's peer groups, it could be triads, it could be work groups, but that students are entirely present with the content, with one another, and they're engaged in the learning process. And so these are things that we're looking for. The interpretation of evidence and the next steps, understanding, having students understand where they are relative to the learning target, the teacher communicating that effectively, or peers, either through conversation or the use of a rubric or an exemplar, interpreting where they stand, where their peers stand, and how to best progress. And, of course, then it's acting on the evidence and making a plan and responding. So formative assessment really is kind of the very air we breathe in a classroom that's active, that's engaged, and where students are learning effectively.
Great. Thanks, Bethany. I have just a quick follow-up question on that. You describe a great environment in which it's embedded, at least the kind of understanding of the process is embedded kind of at that school or district level, and that teachers are showing that they have set up their structures in their classroom well for that. And I think that's very exciting. What are your thoughts on a teacher who is in a school where there isn't that kind of larger structure in place? Can they still be successful at doing this work even when the kind of definition or shared understanding at the school or district level isn't there?
That's a great question, Joel. I know in the text Professional Capital, that text speaks to the value of our peers in contributing to a rich learning environment. But certainly if you're a pioneer in a learning environment where you want to engage formative assessment strategies and really engage your students in monitoring their own learning and becoming masters of their own learning. There's certainly lots of resources out there that can support you, and just starting small with one of your colleagues and we can always find people to talk to that have common interests with us in our schools and in our buildings, and just even having one person, maybe it's your evaluator, maybe it's a peer mentor or a literacy coach or a math coach, to come into your classroom and coach you and give you ideas about how to build an environment that engages more formative assessment strategies is certainly a next step if you don't have a rich environment where the structures are already in place.
Great. Thank you. That's great insight. John, your work with CELT means that you get to work with schools and districts and educators all over the country. Do you have any additional observations about this particular topic, how formative assessment can be integrated into the classroom?
Sure. And again, good overview there and the answer by Bethany. But, I think you brought it up earlier, Joel, that it's a process. And to us, when we're out there in the schools, it's good process needs good tools. And, I'd say making a certain type of banking transaction or an investment transaction is a process. But we have phenomenal tools to do that. Whether we're booking an airline ticket or whatever, we have incredible tools. And that's probably what we see the most. You have teachers out there excited and engaged in collecting evidence and providing students that much needed feedback. And Bethany brought up the word rubrics. And so we need some type of simple, easy-to-use tool to help us with this inventory of learning and transactions that we're going on. Because if I see evidence of effectiveness or I'm collecting evidence, I don't have time to type that all in. And then I got to type in the student's name, and I'm trying to remember, did I actually see that happen with that student yesterday? And if we have the right tools, we really do not care that much. And let me give you an example that always disappoints me, that in classrooms throughout this country, the custodians use a tool to inventory the furniture, but that same tool is not afforded to the classroom teacher to inventory learning. And that's something as simple as a barcode. So there are barcode tools out there that allow a teacher to use a Word document and put in some of the evidence they're likely to see and some of the feedback they're likely to provide. And it's their own tool. They create it. But rather than have to type it all in, they could simply have it on their laptop or tablet. They can point and click at it. They can barcode it, either way, depending upon what kind of tools teachers have, because certainly the tablet changes some of that. But I worry a lot about whether or not the teachers have those tools. And Bethany talked about the walk-in evaluations, and a lot of those are in teacher evaluations. So I sometimes see them in the hands of those that are evaluating our teachers, and I see them in the hands of the custodians. I'd like to see those same tools in the hands of the teachers, and that's how we can answer this question of how can formative assessment be effectively integrated in the classroom. That would be just one
great. Yeah, that's great, John. The ingenuity that comes sometimes with a lack of resources, it can be quite surprising. There are some really effective tools and things that can be done, or different ways of looking at how to do something that we probably have people who are participants here who have pioneered a few different types of ways, and part of that is certainly sharing those best practices out. And we're going to get to that in just a minute, but what I'd like to maybe focus on next a little bit is this question about how can formative assessment be used to support the curriculum. Now, we talked I talked a little bit earlier about defining a process. We established our shared understanding here. But we know that curriculum in general is shifting with Common Core, and the fact that most states are participating in either PARCC or the Smarter Balanced consortiums to help deliver the assessments. With the changing or evolving curriculum that teachers are facing, with the changing and evolving testing and assessment environment, how can formative assessment be used to help support that, to connect the dots, as it were? John, do you have thoughts on that?
Sure. That's a great question, because we've got the Common Core state standards at the top, and then we've got that well defined, and then we've got PARCC and Smarter Balance, and those are well defined, and now the piece in the middle, of course, is what we do in the teaching and learning transaction, and oftentimes that's referred to as the curriculum. So a couple of things that I think formative assessment does to support the curriculum or really change it, and certainly that curriculum document, that course of studies, that program guide, curriculum guide is really an important document. But sadly, it's also the most static document. And I think what happens with formative assessment is it's going to create a situation where that has to now become a living, breathing, organic, live document. And let me give you maybe two illustrations of that. As we all know, formative assessment illustrates learner progress and provides the teacher the data necessary to, I think, footnote the curriculum. So all of a sudden it's like, wow, based on that learner progress and these adjustments I've made and this evidence I've gathered, I need to convene a group of people, and let's not rewrite the whole curriculum like we used to do when I was a teacher, but let's just make a footnote there. Let's modify that, and we can do that in real time, and we're going to be able to do that because as we look at these learner management systems, and again I'm going to go back to a systems view, back to a data, back to a tool, because we can't do this in a helter-skelter way. So I think the way in which formative assessment can support the curriculum is when we're able to view and align. We can see on a screen, there it is. I see my student needs. I can see the curriculum. I can see on my screen the formative assessment results, the instructional strategies and resources. But here's also something important, and Bethany was talking about it earlier, and that is those teacher proficiencies. So it's just not only to, I think, to support the curriculum, but also to support staff development in that area. So I think it's really when we're able to use the data to tweak that curriculum, and then we're making the curriculum used and useful and visible based on student evidence and not just there it is. And I think a lot of young teachers would really benefit from having that student evidence connected to. But right now, sadly, formative assessment's an island over here. We may or may not have a learning management system, and we need to help pull some of that data together.
Yeah, that's great, John. It does sometimes feel a bit helter-skelter. There's a lot of content information. There's a lot of pressures on teachers in a number of different ways, and being able to kind of organize that into a coherent strategy, something that fits with the other movements happening around teachers and in schools, I think is a critical part of supporting the curriculum itself. Bethany, do you have anything that you can point to in your experience about how formative assessment supports curriculum?
Absolutely. And maybe before I do, I just want to respond to John's statement because I find it so powerful. John, you mentioned that that curriculum guides have been static documents, and I certainly can agree with you as we transition away from our state standards and towards the Common Core standards. As we've been transitioning, as we've made that change, we've adopted a curriculum mapping software, and while we haven't, I kind of got the sense, you were saying hold on to what's good and useful with that curriculum that's static, but see if you can't integrate some kind of accessibility to the curriculum. And so in our transition to the Common Core, we elected to use a curriculum mapping software, and it has just exploded the possibility in our district in terms of making the curriculum dynamic and making it accessible to all of our staff, and it's just so exciting. We're able to upload artifacts, examples of student work, rubrics, look-fors that teachers that can really guide the instructional experience, and that can really help shape during the formative assessment process when you're delivering the curriculum, when you're engaging the students with the curriculum. You have an opportunity to look at artifacts from previous classrooms to see the progression of previous groups so that you have a better sense of how your students are progressing, which is so rich and so exciting. So I'm very happy to say that our transition to the Common Core has helped us reframe how we're approaching our standards and also how we're managing the information. So that's been very satisfying. But to get at how formative assessment can be used to support the curriculum, when we move forward with, we bring our curriculum into our classroom, all the strategies that we're using should be in service to the intended learning. And formative assessment is one of our strategies that guides the learning experience. And so in this process, having a curriculum that specifies clear learning targets and sharing those clear learning targets with students and having students reiterate those learning targets in their own language and with their peers and talking about them and talking through them is very helpful. Make the demonstration of learning evidence clear and well aligned to the intended learning. That's how formative assessment can support that curriculum implementation. You want to ask your students to lead or partner in the interpretation of learning evidence. That's another way that formative assessment, again, how you are understanding how your students are working their way through the learning content. When students lead each other or partner, pair up, and look at each other's work, it's a very, very rich opportunity for students to understand how others are interpreting the curriculum and to broaden learners' experience with that curriculum. And what you're doing is you are distributing that learning process and building an ownership of the learning between all of the students in the classroom, and having them not only collaborate with the teacher but also collaborate with one another to build a true learning environment. and that's all done through the process of formative assessment, through checking, students checking their work against their peers and against themselves. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's great. You know, that brings up a really good point, that formative assessment itself, the process isn't necessarily or isn't at all tied to one assessor. That peer assessment is particularly valuable as well, because that gives students that kind of immediate feedback. And without clear learning targets, and I remember one school that I was at where the essential questions that they were tackling were on the board. It was something every student understood they would need to be able to answer, and they would be able to assess each other's work against those essential questions. And it was that kind of that tying together between the curriculum itself and then the formative assessment piece to just keep checking, am I getting closer to being able to answer that question effectively, that I think showed great results for students in that school. Now, I will make a comment here as we move through. It appears that John Filippo may have had a technical problem. He's not with us at the moment on the panel. So we're going to continue through. We have a few additional questions, I think, of great value, and Bethany and I will take those on.
Joel.
And oh, yes.
Hey, Joel, I'm on the phone. It's the screen that got lost, but I'll get that back connected.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks, John. Your name is not on our panelist list anymore, so if anyone else was seeing that and confused, fortunately you are with us, so that is fantastic.
No problem.
Okay.
Never trust the technology.
Fair enough. says our panelist from the Center for Educational Leadership and Technology.
Right.
That's great. That's great. Okay, well let's move on. There's so much time we could spend on these questions, and we have such a limited amount of time, and I want to ensure that we have an opportunity for our Q&A at the end of this. So, Bethany, I'm going to come back to you for this question, and again, it's one that I think we are getting at in some of the examples we've brought up or some of the discussions we've had, but I wonder if you have some more thoughts on how formative assessment can be used as a teaching strategy, specifically for our teachers on the phone. What does it mean to them? So if you would help walk us through that for a minute or two here.
Sure. I have some great examples. I've had the pleasure of observing in classrooms where classroom teachers have used formative assessments. I've had the opportunity as a teacher myself to use formative assessment in classrooms, and all to guide my instruction. And I have to say that when I was teaching doctoral students a research course, and in planning for that instruction, what I would do is I would plan identify the learning objectives and plan the experiences that I wanted my students to have in order for them to understand the process of the different concepts in the process of conducting research. And I always planned for the students that, common typical misunderstandings and how that might trip up our progress through the ideas. But I also always planned for, I had this fabulous student, Jeremy, because as we use our formative assessment techniques, we're going to find that, yes, we are going to come across evidence that points to remediation and revisiting and going back and explaining something or looking at something another way. But we also have the opportunity with formative assessment, when students demonstrate effective learning and we want to plan for a deeper dive, before we ever get to class, I was always planning for Jeremy, because he was always asking great questions about statistics and how we apportion degrees of freedom and all those things that we just don't think about so much now. But I always planned for him because as I was teaching and assessing where my students were and who was understanding what, and walking through the classroom and looking at their notes and asking them to apply their learning, I wanted to make sure that I could meet those learners who were far ahead of where the rest of the group was. So I would plan a detour into a detail that my advanced learners would find particularly interesting in order to make sure that I kept their engagement and their interest. So formative assessment as a teaching strategy, as you're walking through the classroom, gathering your evidence about what students know and are able to do, you will see that students are tuned out, and sometimes it's because they need to go back and they've missed a point, and it's an important point in their learning progression, but it also sometimes is that you just have a fabulous mind there, and that's what I'm excited about the Common Core standards, because they really invite us to go deeper and to really look with more detail at some of the things that maybe we haven't done in the past. And so that's just one example from my own teaching, but I also think there are great resources online. Sarah Brown-Wessling, who's a teacher who does videos for the teaching channel, has this great strategy that she uses, a formative assessment strategy, teaching strategy called Text What You Learned, where at the beginning of the class, students come in and use their cell phones. This is a high school class. Use their cell phones to text to the Poll Everywhere software and text in a response to a question that Ms. Wessling has presented to them. And what she does is she projects those responses, those text messages, up on a smartboard, and this gives students an opportunity to share what they've learned, see what their peers have learned, and also, so that gives them an opportunity to self-assess. And then what Ms. Brown-Wessling does is she takes those text messages and she drops them into a word cloud generator, which is another piece of internet software. And that software takes the most popular, most commonly occurring words and varies the size of the text. So the most common appearing word has the largest typeface in the word cloud. So what this does is it kind of summarizes the qualitative data of all of those text messages into a single visual where students and Ms. Brown-Wessling can lead them. She can lead the students through a conversation about what the common terms were in the text messages, and it is really engaging for students, and it gives you a really good information as a teacher on how to move forward. If you don't have that level of technology in your classroom, you can, at the beginning of your class, do a quick write, which is when you ask the students to provide you with, you could say a 15-word summary, a 50-word summary, or a 100-word summary, depending on the level of your learners, and those are just, broad numbers I'm using. But you can present a question and ask them to provide you with, for example, a 15-word summary of what the homework was about or what the key point in the reading was last night for their homework. And they can either hand these in to you as the instructor, or they could hand them, you could collect them and hand them back out to the class, and then go through a process of reading them independently, sharing them with the person next to you, do a think, pair, share, all to really understand where we need to start today's lesson. So those are just a couple ideas of how formative assessment really has to and it can very effectively guide instruction.
Great, thanks, Bethany. Great answer, great examples, some great strategies there. Typically I'm moving back and forth between the both of you, and like I said, I think there's so much great ground to mine here. What I'd like to do is kind of move us forward just a little bit we're going to move over one of our questions here, and we can always come back to it if we find that some of the questions from our panelists or from our participants lead us to that. But I would certainly encourage looking at other types of formative assessments. I think, Bethany, your answer kind of got at this a little bit. And so we'll consider it as part of that. The last question we have here, again, Bethany, I think we're going to start with you, but John, I want you to also be able to respond and think about this as well. And that is, we have an understanding of the process itself. We have some strategies. We know that we've got the, we've clarified, we talked a little bit about learning targets, eliciting evidence, what are the ways in which we can pull out, what tools might we use, strategies for assessing itself. And then interpreting, understanding what it means in context, and we'd need to know our learning targets. So I really want to focus on that last piece, the acting on evidence here. And so if we have results from this, we either across our class, it's been a classroom response system is giving us immediate results, or maybe it's cards, red, green, yellow, for different levels of understanding. Whatever strategy we've employed, we now have that, but we've got to act on it. So Bethany, maybe you can walk us through for a couple minutes how instruction can be differentiated in response to formative assessment findings. If you can help us understand that a bit.
Okay. Well, I think I have done a little bit of talking about this, but when the instructor is fully present in the classroom and the students are fully present in the classroom, and again, I know with there are just so many things that distract us on any given day, but when we are fully present in the classroom, formative assessment is an ongoing, fluid experience for our learners. And so with your reading groups, maybe your early grades, early literacy reading groups, and monitoring closely the progress those learners are making along the developmental continuum of developing reading skills. Certainly that information can help the teacher understand which students to, which resources to direct to which students. When we get to our little bit, students become a little bit older, they're a little bit more self-directed. So our teachers, typically, a pattern that I've observed is that our teachers are much more closely focused on the individual learners with the very young children, but as students become older, those students are more metacognitively aware, they're monitoring and self-regulating their own learning, and so the teacher has to do more of, may have to question more and provide more formal ways to demonstrate learning. And of course, students are a little bit older and they have a little bit more skill when it comes to writing and reading different resources. And so during the process of formative assessment, we can certainly understand exactly what question to ask, what probe to follow up with, you know, and when we analyze student work, what pieces of the process students may not be understanding. Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, preparing questions ahead of time so that we are asking questions and we are aligning those questions or asking for demonstrations of learning and aligning those demonstrations with common misunderstandings so that we can check for, to ensure that students are really that they're not falling into misunderstanding traps and that they're progressing correctly along a continuum. But for the most part, formative assessment is a spontaneous, on-the-fly process so long as the teacher, you know, you've done your preparation ahead of time, you know the content that you're going to cover, whether it's information or a procedure, and you have an understanding of the progression you want your students to make. It can be a very spontaneous, very fluid process. And when you provide feedback, you do have to, you know, formative assessment, unlike formal assessments, is more, it happens in the teaching moment. And, you know, we do give quizzes, we do give tests, but those are more formal measures of student learning. So I think I'm answering your question, Joel.
Yeah, that's great. No, Bethany, that's perfect. I really appreciate it. That's a great, well thought out, thoughtful answer. John, any additional thoughts on this question from your perspective?
Well, you know, Joel, I'd like to maybe if we could just go back to the question we skipped and
sure, of course.
Go back just for a couple of comments. You know, I'm going to tie my response for 3 questions into one response. So the whole idea of using formative assessment as a teaching strategy, you know, think about it as curriculum tells us what to do. It does not tell us how to do it. And now all of a sudden, the teachers that Bethany's describing, they have evidence of student success. They have the learning maps she talked about. We have kinds of student work. And now we're able to get a shared responsibility between the student and the teacher. So that really will change the teaching strategy, because when you have all that evidence and student works and learning maps in front of you, you're going to change the way you're going to try to teach part of that curriculum. The other question I want to go back to, and then to the last one real quick, is, not what types of formative assessment are most effective for assessing student understanding and nurturing retention, but I think what are the elements of a good formative assessment system? And I would argue that a couple of things I would look for as an element of a good formative assessment. It would be those that help us effectively communicate the same information in a consistent and easy format to students, teachers, parents, and administrators in real time. Because we have this odd situation in education where the same information is described about assessment is described differently to all 4 or 5 of those audiences. I think formative assessment really gives us a framework to change that in many, many ways. I also think we're looking for formative assessment where the way in which you do formative assessment, you've got an import and export of the student learning results to the LMS, to the learning management system, and to that homeschool portal. I think we have to be careful that we don't try to communicate with the parents about formative assessment through different channels and different pipes. I think that homeschool portal is an important element of a good formative assessment, a way to give that parent feedback and make them part of the learning process more. But I'm going to stop there. A few other comments, but I really need to stop there because we really need to let our participants in.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, John. And I think that, like I said, for those of you that are listening today, this is, a broad overview with some deep dives here and there. And of course, the more that you can explore within your own craft and experience and environment, the more you can participate in these kinds of events to learn about strategies and things of that nature. I think the better off you and your students will be. We do have some questions, so I will transition into that. If you have any additional ones, please feel free to send them to Liz, our host. She's passing them along to me. I don't know that we'll get to all of them, but we will get to the ones that we can. We have a question here. Again, either John or Bethany, if you want to take this. The question is, do you have any suggestions for developing student awareness that feedback is for their use, especially in a context where there's no school culture for this? The person writes, they're already using rubrics and written detailed standards. So any thoughts, any suggestions for working directly with the student, developing their awareness around how they can use this kind of feedback?
Can I jump in, John?
Bethany, your time. Yes.
Okay, I'm thinking right away that one of the strategies I've seen in action that's very effective for kind of enculturating students toward the use of feedback to improve their performance is to give them papers that are that have feedback on them without a grade. Because if there's only a mastery grade, what will happen is the students will, until they make all the changes that the feedback indicates, they won't be able to have a complete assignment. So one of the strategies I've seen is, again, to not grade an assignment until all of the feedback has been addressed.
That's great. John, any additional thoughts on that question?
Yeah, just real quick, I think it's so engaging when the student understands where they're going, but they also understand how they got there. And think about, one of my other comments was going to be, eventually these students will have that tablet or their phone, and that will be their GPS for learning. And they'll be able to scroll backwards and say, yep, this is how I get to this crossroad for learning. And if I do this and this, I'll be able to go straight forward. So
that's great.
That's a great question, because we often forget that we make teachers aware of it and parents are aware of it, but forget the students.
Yeah, absolutely. Next question, what are some key forums or online communities where people are sharing ideas around formative assessment? John, do you have any that come to mind that you've seen, or any conversations going on, or ways that people that can engage further in these conversations? Well,
for us, I mean, we rely pretty heavily on ASCD, and there's an interesting book that they have out called Advancing Formative Assessment in Every Classroom. by Connie Moss and Susan Brookhart, and that's a place to start. But good question. I mean, that's something that we probably need to do and get others involved. Yeah. And again, we don't need any more books or articles. We need dialogue.
Right. Bethany, any thoughts on this one?
Let's see. I know that Edutopia has some great resources. I mentioned the teaching channel earlier. I know that the Smarter Balanced, if you're a Smarter Balanced state, I'm not sure exactly when the digital library will open, but there are some tremendous resources there. Also, TeacherTube and YouTube offer some great, when you search formative assessment, if you're a student of formative assessment, I know I am. I'm always learning something new. So those are some great resources. If you like videos, John mentioned Susan Brookhart. She is just fabulous. There are some great books out. I believe Dylan Williams just came out with a book as well on formative assessment. And, of course, Margaret Heritage has another, is a great wealth of resources for reading about formative assessment. John Hattie also in his books, Visible Learning and Visible Learning for Teachers, those are wonderful resources. I also, I think I really like a quick 5 to 10 minute video, and I can find that I fit those into my day easily, and I find those mainly on the teaching channel.
Great. Thanks, Bethany. I want to echo, first of all, the recommendation of Hattie's Visible Learning for Teachers. His Visible Learning book is a tremendous resource for anybody who wants to have a kind of a objective, quantifiable data about the impact of these kinds of strategies. It's been it's probably the first book I go to when I work with schools and with teachers on this on these topics to help put this work in context. And in addition, Dylan Williams does have one. He may have a new one, but I know his Embedded Formative Assessment book from a number of years ago gives just a wealth of very specific strategies, both technology-based and non-technology-based, that I think can be used effectively in classrooms. But then I also agree, John, with you that the dialogue, the communities, I think ASCD is a great resource. The opportunity to engage with people in whatever forum you can is fantastic. So look for those videos and those opportunities. We have one last question here, and then we'll wrap up. And that is a question that comes in asking, at what age do we find our students generally able to participate in self-monitoring in a school system where there is a culture of formative assessment? So I think this really is kind of getting at something that's come out a few different times, which is involving students more intently and intensively in their understanding of their own progress towards mastery, understanding what their own assessment is and how to craft solutions to the futures, the teachers assisting with that. So do we have maybe any experience or thoughts from John or Bethany, from either of you, about where you might have seen this work effectively? To what age down to or grade level might we see this in? So thoughts from either of you.
I have to say that I've seen it. I have a preschooler, and I've seen it in my students, my son's preschool class, because students know what the rules are. They know what the red stop line, when the teacher points to the red stoplight, they know what that means. So I think that self-monitoring, the complexity of self-monitoring, as we get to more abstract ideas and things that are less concrete, there's a whole continuum of development that people progress through. But I think we're never too young to self-monitor.
Great, John. Any additional thoughts?
Yeah. As soon as they can say, I can do that for myself, they're ready to go. And they start that, as Bethany says, way beyond the preschool years.
Yeah, I think one thing to remember is one of the strategies we would employ, and especially for very young children, would be the use of exemplars. Now, we might not tell them the word exemplar, but I too have a son in preschool. And when they are doing artwork, for example, they know what the target looks like and can be taught the ability to examine their own work and the exemplar and understand what they need to address. I hear my son, I mean, a very basic thing we're probably all very used to is coloring outside the lines, and he can now understand when that's happening and make the appropriate adjustments without a teacher having to tell him that. So I do think it can be down there, and I think that especially for, given really a lot of this is around, and we could dive into this too, the zone of proximal development, right? Understanding where they are in their development and making sure that the strategies we employ are appropriate. I think things like exemplars can be great methods to bring out the ability to self-monitor in situations like this. Well, we're reaching the end of our time. Before we go, Bethany and then John, I'd like to offer you any last opportunity to share your thoughts on the role of formative assessment, maybe just a 30-second wrap-up of what you'd like people to take away from this event today.
Oh, am I going first?
Yes, Bethany, sorry, yes.
All right, thank you so much, Joel. Joel and John, I think this has been delightful and certainly a wonderful opportunity. I did fail to mention that Doug Lemov is also one of my favorite authors. Teach Like a Champion, both the text and the field book were great. I'm excited about formative assessment. I think it's a crucial component to the learning environment. The 4 pieces of that process: clarifying intended learning, eliciting evidence, interpreting that evidence, and taking action on it. I think that's a great and very straightforward model that we can use to frame our expectations and our common conversations about formative assessment. So thank you so much for the opportunity to participate today.
Great. Thank you, Bethany. John, any last thoughts? John, are you with us?
Sorry about that. You have to
it's okay.
come off the mute. Well, again,
yes.
My closing thoughts and my passion are really that hopefully formative assessment just doesn't become another island in K-12 education. That we really find a way to connect the dots. And what I mean by connecting the dots, for example, is based on this formative assessment, I see these learning results. I need to now take those learning results and correlate them to the high-stakes tests so that it's not a mystery in Massachusetts for my colleagues when the students take the MCAS as to what they're going to get. Students should know 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, based upon the evidence-based learning in the classroom. Here's what you know and here's what you don't know based upon what they're going to assess. And so we've got to connect, we have to do this important formative assessment work, but please let's not forget to connect the dots.
Great. Thank you, John. And again, thank you, everyone. Hopefully this was a valuable conversation that you'll be able to continue in whatever context, in whatever environment you have, even those of you in challenging environments where there isn't a culture of support for formative assessment. Please, I think there were some great resources and ideas. Hopefully you can build that in your own communities. And with that, Liz, I'll hand it back to you for any closing instructions we have here. But again, I thank you, everyone, for participating.
Great. Thank you, Joel. Just as a reminder, we did record this webinar, so you will be getting an email later this week, probably by Friday, with a copy of the slides that were used in today's presentation and a link to the recording. And if you have any additional questions or concerns, please feel free to email me. And that is it. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.